Parenting involves making decisions and choices every day, sometimes dozens of them, many without a whole lot of time to ponder those decisions. Your child asks for a cookie. Should you give it to him? Your child drops some dishes and breaks them. Should you punish her for that? Your child asks you a question about what a war is. How should you answer? The context and the age of the child matters a lot in all of these situations, of course. But you don't typically have the luxury of pressing the pause button and pondering what to do for a few minutes. Over time, parents develop a style of interacting with their children. We may never explicitly think about that style of interaction, but it drives many of these moment-to-moment decisions and ultimately affects our relationships with our children and their development as well, a great deal. This lecture is about research that's been conducted on parenting styles over the last several decades, and about what that research suggests about how those different parenting styles can affect children's behavior, how it can affect their social and cognitive development, even how it can affect their long-term happiness. At a basic level, this research is a continuation of material from the last lecture about how we should correct children when they make mistakes or misbehave. But there's also a deeper level at which parenting styles matter, perhaps a lot more. How we parent our children is a lot about how we teach them right from wrong. The measures that researchers use in these studies I'll be describing they're often about school success, emotional well-being, and social skills. These are things that developmental scientists can quantify and analyze. But how you tell your child when he's right and when he's wrong accumulates over time. It accumulates into how the child thinks about what's right and what's wrong. This is a lecture about parenting styles, but we'll revisit this question of moral development as well. I only have one main tip for this lecture, but it's a big one. It's a complex conglomeration of a lot of parenting skills. To enhance your child's development and well-being, you should strive to be an authoritative parent. You should resist being authoritarian, which sounds similar but isn't. And you should resist being permissive. You should also strive not to be uninvolved, but if you're a parent watching this, I think there's little worry there. Let me start by roughly defining what I mean by these four styles of parenting: authoritarian, authoritative, permissive, and uninvolved. Diana Baumrind was the first one to propose this approach in 1966. She based it on her observations of a lot of parents interacting with their children at daycare centers near the University of California at Berkeley, where she worked. She defined authoritarian parents as those who were relatively strict in their control of the children. When an authoritarian parent asks a child to do something, he or she will typically react very negatively if the child asks why. When a parent answers a questioning child with the term, "because I said so," he or she is exhibiting a core tendency of authoritarian parenting style. Authoritarian parents tend to control their children's behaviors with punishments or threats of punishments. They're often not willing to explain the reasoning behind their responses. An authoritarian parent tends not to be warm in dealing with his or her children. They also tend not to be especially responsive to the particular moment-to-moment needs of the child. When I define authoritarian parents in this way, I think many people think of a mean boss barking orders and making threats aimed at sweet, naive children. The definition seems to preclude the possibility that authoritarian parents love their children very much. I want to be clear that this is simply not what I'm saying. An authoritarian parent may love his or her children very, very much, more than life itself. Indeed, most authoritarian parents would say that they're strict in teaching their children how to behave explicitly because they love and care about how they grow up. There's nothing inherently evil about an authoritarian parent. It's a style of parenting, that's all. I'll describe some studies suggesting that this parenting style leads to certain problems, but it's not in and of itself an evil thing. Right, so that's authoritarian parenting. It's sort of one extreme along a continuum of parenting styles. The other end of that continuum is permissive parenting. Permissive parents tend to be nurturing, warm, and responsive to those moment-to-moment needs of their children. And a permissive parent only very rarely imposes limits on their children's behavior. A permissive parent is very likely to discuss with the child why they should behave in a certain way. They may be very good at this communication, actually, and even exert some control over their children, but mostly by being a little manipulative, convincing the child that they want to do the thing that the parent wants them to do. But a permissive parent would only very rarely tell a child to behave in a certain way, simply because they, as a parent, feel it's the right thing to do. Indeed, the thing about a permissive parent that might catch your attention if you see them out there in the world is their seeming lack of awareness when their children are misbehaving. As with the authoritarian definition, the permissive definition at the extreme seems to suggest a lack of caring, but it doesn't. Most permissive parents would say that they want their children to learn to control their own behaviors. By having the freedom to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes on their own, a permissive parent may very much have the goal in mind of promoting good development in their child. So, authoritarian parents are very controlling with their kids and not very warm in their interactions. Permissive parents are very warm in their interactions with their children and not very controlling. Authoritative parents, this third parenting style category, are those who are both warm and controlling. Authoritative parents set clear limits for their children, like an authoritarian parent, and they enforce those limits, sometimes quite strictly. At the same time, however, authoritative parents are sensitive to those moment-to-moment requests for information, frankly, from the child. They listen, they encourage their child to think and to participate in these decisions. Unlike a permissive parent, they may be very strict about something, but they'll also be quick to explain to the children why they're being strict about it. The one other category that researchers have noted and studied a bit is that of uninvolved parents. Uninvolved parents are low both in terms of this warmth and control. By and large, they just don't seem to be very interested in their kids. This is perhaps due to something like a clinical depression, maybe because they're just modeling the behavior that they received when they were children. I'm not going to talk a lot about uninvolved parents, but suffice it to say that not being involved in your children's lives, especially not paying much attention to them or interacting with them, that's a bad thing. Children are highly dependent on their parents to mediate normal development. I'll talk about some problems associated with authoritarian and permissive parenting styles, but all of the outcomes for uninvolved parents are much worse. That said, on a more hopeful note, a parent who has been uninvolved also has the most to gain by changing their parenting styles. Okay, so this is the theory. Any parent has a particular style of interaction with their child that falls somewhere on this continuum of these four categories. How would you study parenting styles? How would research on it work? Somehow we need a method for assessing the parenting style, and then we need research to see how developmental outcomes are related to those different styles. There are many different methods that have been developed for assessing parenting style. Over the years, researchers have come up with a lot of different solutions to this problem, but the most frequent is to have parents fill out a questionnaire with a series of statements on it. The Parental Authority Questionnaire, developed by John Bury, is one of the most common instruments used here. For each of a series of statements, a parent indicates if they agree with the statement or not. Often a scale from 1 to 5 is used, where 1 means they strongly agree with the statement and 5 means they strongly disagree. To check for authoritarian parenting style, statements are included such as, if my child misbehaves at a restaurant, I sometimes raise my voice and indicate that if he does not behave, he'll be punished. Or a statement like, children should do what their parents ask without question, regardless of whether they're given a reason. Obviously, authoritarian parents will tend to give higher ratings than non-authoritarian parents. Permissive parents will typically indicate that they disagree with these statements. To check for permissive parenting style, other elements of the questionnaire include statements like, children should be given freedom to behave as they choose, or if my children argue with one another, I allow them to work it out themselves. Again, permissive parents will tend to agree with these statements, and authoritarian parents will tend to indicate they strongly disagree. Authoritative parents tend to give mid-range answers for all of these questions that are targeted specifically at authoritarian and permissive parenting styles. They also tend to give high agreement ratings for other questions specifically aimed at authoritative parenting. For instance, authoritative parents will tend to respond with strong agreement for statements such as, when parents correct their children's behavior, it's important to explain why they're being corrected. Questionnaires are good as research tools since they can be administered quickly and easily. For For the best questionnaires, a lot of statistical validation work has also been put into developing them. For instance, if you've worded your test items well, then there should be a high correlation between all of those authoritarian items. That is, if your items are all measuring the same underlying construct. In the case of the Bureau Parental Authority questionnaire, that's certainly the case. The validity of the questionnaires is also typically tested to make sure that the response data match up with other methods that maybe are more labor-intensive and require a lot more time and energy. For instance, in some studies in this area, researchers have observed children as they try to solve a difficult puzzle. Usually they do this while their parents are nearby. Parents who are authoritarian are far more likely to intervene and take over the task for the child than are permissive parents. That is, the results of the questionnaire responses, which are easy to collect, have been shown to predict real-world behaviors that are relevant to parenting style. One recent study even found significant associations between parental-style questionnaire assessments and how parents feed their toddler-age children. Parents who score high on those authoritarian aspects of the questionnaire, for instance, are more likely to press their child to finish all of their oatmeal. They'll keep at it longer than parents who fall into that permissive parenting style category. These quick survey-like answers seem to predict a lot about how parents actually behave, not just how they respond on questionnaires. Similarly, in-home observations have often been shown to be related to the answers that parents give on these questionnaires. Parents who give high ratings for the authoritative questions, for example, they're very often engaged in authoritative interactions with their children. They set those clear boundaries, but they're also relatively warm in how they explain and enforce them. So to summarize this approach so far, questionnaires can be used to assess the extent to which parents exhibit warmth and control relative to others. And these scores can then be used to assess the parenting style that they use with their kids. It should be noted that very few parents fit the extreme textbook definitions of any of these parenting styles. They're out there, of course. There are parents who behave a lot like drill sergeants with their kids. There are others who let their kids run wild all the time. Most people, however, fall somewhere in between these extremes, somewhere along this continuum from authoritarian to permissive. There are also some parents who have a mixed style. They may be very permissive in some situations or places, while quite authoritarian in others. Here, the parenting style is described as inconsistent. Okay, so what happens next? We have this instrument, this questionnaire for assessing parenting style. What can we do with that? Over the past several decades, there have been literally dozens of very large-scale studies that have found interesting correlations between parenting style and developmental outcomes in children. Kids raised by authoritarian parents are, perhaps not surprisingly, better behaved than the average child. They tend to get in trouble at school less often. They tend to be better at following rules. That said, there are a variety of negative outcomes associated with authoritarian parenting as well. Kids of authoritarian parents are significantly more likely to experience depression and anxiety issues later in childhood, even in adulthood. Other studies have suggested that these children also experience more frequent social problems. For instance, these kids have lower self-esteem and they tend to feel less accepted by their peers. Other studies of cognitive development have suggested that these authoritarian-raised kids are less flexible thinkers. They score worse than the average child on problem-solving tasks, for instance. These kids also score worse than the average children on self-regulation tests. In the very first lecture of this course, I talked about connections between self-regulation and executive function. This is one of the most central and important mental faculties that humans have. This low self-regulation associated with authoritarian parenting, it's related to a host of other negative outcomes. For example, lower math achievement. Eventually, when they're teens, this authoritarian-raised group is also more likely to go through a period of rebelling against parental authority figures. That is, rejecting the very authority that's controlled their behavior for so long. There's a stereotype promoted by a lot of Hollywood movies and after-school specials and things like that about the rebellious, angry teenager. Research on teens has suggested that this doesn't actually apply to most kids. Most teens report having a good, warm, communicative relationship with their parents all throughout the teen years. The teens who do tend to go through this angry young man or angry young woman phase are those who've been raised by authoritarian parents. At the other end of the parenting style continuum, the children of permissive parents, those kids also seem to exhibit a host of negative outcomes. They misbehave more, including at school. No surprise there, given the lack of parental control they've experienced. They tend to watch many more hours of television than the average child, and they're more likely to be obese. As older kids, they're more likely to have problems with alcohol and drug abuse. All of these problems, those associated with both authoritarian and permissive parenting, are significantly less frequent and severe in children raised with an authoritative parenting style. It seems that strong parental control is actually very important, but so is parental warmth. The real challenge is to incorporate both of these things at the same time. It's important to make it clear to children that you, as the parent, are very much in charge. An authoritative parent sets those limits, provides reasons for the limits, but sets those limits, and then clearly guards against any breaking of that framework. But an authoritative parent also maintains a warm and respectful relationship with children. It might be that even as those firm limits are set, that the authoritative parent discusses where the limits should be with the child, that the child's involved in deciding where those limits should be. If a child is involved in deciding what the rules are, she's likely to be much more respectful of them in the future. This is also called the democratic style of parenting, since the child is experiencing how to be a member of a rule-based democracy. Discussing the reasons for a given rule, even taking a problem-solving approach in which the child is a partner with the parent, seems to be absolutely critical in this domain. Even if the child doesn't completely understand that explanation, and your average 3 to 5-year-old might have a hard time understanding many such explanations, the mere act of taking the time to give the explanation seems to matter a lot. For instance, authoritative parents are more likely to engage in a practice referred to as inductive discipline. The basic idea here of inductive discipline is that when you ask a child to change her behavior, you explain how that change might affect others, not just her. When you yell and scream here in the restaurant, Susie, you make it hard for everyone else to enjoy their lunch. If you could talk quietly, we will still hear you just fine, and then everyone else can have their conversations too. There was one study run by Craig Hart and his colleagues at Louisiana State University, in which they assessed the extent to which 106 parents of children between 3 and 5 years of age used inductive discipline on a regular basis. They then observed these children as they played on a playground. They found that the more inductive discipline that the kids experienced at home, the less frequently the children engaged in disruptive behaviors on the playground. Giving children explanations for why they should change their behavior works, especially when children are involved in an inductive, problem-solving kind of approach. So it's really the hallmark of authoritative parenting style. Given this research on parenting styles and the relation between parenting style and child development, one might wonder why anyone would employ anything but authoritative parenting. There doesn't seem to be any downside. Why wouldn't everyone do it? Part of the explanation is that many parents just don't know about this research. But another aspect is a continual conflict that parents face between wanting to help your child be the best they can be in the short term versus the long term, between wanting to help a child succeed right now and wanting the child to learn how to succeed on their own. Let's consider a concrete example here. Imagine you have a 7-year-old who's learning to play piano. Imagine he's worked at it for a year or two, and he's started to show some impressive achievement. Not a concert-level prodigy or anything like that, but some real talent. Most kids connect with some activity like this as they're growing through the middle years of childhood. Activities that require practice, require work in order to succeed. Any musical instrument, any sporting activity, any artistic activity for that matter, these are all domains in which regular, disciplined, effortful practice is needed if you want to get really good. But this is a problem for most children. They have great energy. They often have great enthusiasm. In many cases, they have great talent. But it's a very rare 7-year-old who has the ability to work hard at something that's not fun, at least not all the time. This has often been described in terms of brain development through these years. Children's frontal lobes are the part of the brain that seem most responsible for long-range planning and the self-control involved in delayed gratification. These frontal lobes will still be developing in the late teens, even in the early 20s. At age 7, they still have a very long way to go. There's another reason that children at this age find consistent hard work especially difficult, however. They simply lack experience with it. If I, as an adult, I decide that I want to get good at something, I understand that if I practice that thing, then I'll get better. I'm very confident of this because throughout my life, I've experienced the performance enhancements that come with practice. I have practiced practicing, if you will. A 7-year-old, in contrast, might have great talent and energy, but probably has little discipline for practice. Parents may not have nearly as much energy or even talent, but we do possess a lot more self-discipline, certainly more than almost any 7-year-old. Perhaps our role as a parent, then, is to provide the benefits of that experience and discipline and make our children practice. But how and how much? There are lots of stories about parents who've pushed their children in a very authoritarian way. They've pushed them to achieve some really great things. Andre Agassi always comes to mind for me here. This is the tennis great. He had a father who drove him to practice relentlessly. At age 7, he was returning 2,500 balls a day that were shot at him from this specially modified tennis ball machine. It was a machine modified to shoot a tennis ball like a cannon. Mike Agassi, Andre's father, reasoned that if his boy hit 2,500 balls a day, that's 17,500 balls a week. That's over 1 million balls a year. And a child who hits 1 million balls a year would be unbeatable. In the case of Andre, he was sort of correct. As successful as Andre Agassi was in the world of tennis, won several major championships, he professed in later life that he didn't love playing tennis. In fact, he wrote in his autobiography that he hated it. He referred to that tennis ball cannon as the dragon and dreaded the hours that he needed to spend with it. In 2011, Amy Chua released a book entitled Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother. This memoir of her experiences raising 2 daughters and of how her parents raised her sparked kind of a media firestorm over the next several months. In the book, Chua described using very forceful, coercive parenting practices to motivate her children, to motivate them to achieve success. The book recounts a wide range of stories, but one of the most salient is about her then 7-year-old daughter learning to play the piano. There was a particularly difficult piece that the daughter was trying to master. After spending some time practicing it and failing, the daughter wanted to stop working on it. Chua said no. Indeed, over the next many hours, she said a lot more than no. Chua threatened her daughter with no lunch or dinner unless she got that piece right. She threatened no Christmas or Hanukkah presents. There would be no birthday parties, not for 2 years, 3 years. Chua accused her daughter of being lazy, cowardly, even pathetic. This went on for hours, past dinner time and into the late evening. At one point, Chua recalls that she wouldn't even let her daughter take a break to go to the bathroom. If the story ended there, I suspect we would never have heard it. But at last, late that night, the daughter made a breakthrough. She learned the piano piece. She learned to play it without making any mistakes. The girl was understandably delighted. Chua notes that her daughter wanted to play the piece over and over and over again. As harsh as the conflict between Chua and her daughter had been throughout the day, once that goal was achieved, the book describes great emotional warmth and closeness. The girl crawled into her mother's bed, they snuggled and hugged, they spent some time just talking, joking, and laughing before falling asleep. Many people, myself kind of included, find this story disturbing. It seems almost to border on child abuse. Not physical abuse, but mental and emotional abuse. That said, Chua's methods got results. Her children are great piano players, no surprise there. They're also academically and professionally very accomplished. They seem, by all accounts, to have grown up to be well-developed, lovely people. You might say to yourself, maybe Amy Chua is right. Maybe a good parent should be doing this sort of thing with their kids. That day that she describes in her story was very emotionally intense for both the child and the mother, but it resulted in success. And big accomplishments are, by and large, just a summation of many smaller successes, right? And as stressful as the day was, at the end, everything seemed to be forgiven. The child was happy. The relationship between the child and the parent didn't seem to be damaged in any way. You might wonder, maybe I should be doing this. Maybe the fact that I'm not doing it is because I'm being lazy. Maybe I'm just unwilling to go through days like that in order to benefit my children. Maybe it's not Amy Chua who's damaging her kids with the pressure. Maybe it's me who's damaging my child with neglect. The problem with using these stories to make parenting decisions, however, is they're just that. They're single anecdotes, single stories about particular individuals. We don't know what Andre Agassi would have done without the authoritarian pushing that he received. The same for Amy Chua's children. The research that I've described here is based on data pulled together from hundreds and hundreds of children. When we look across all of those studies, the advice is very clear. Authoritarian parenting is not the way to go. Children of authoritarian parents tend to suffer more mental illness, get in trouble with the law more frequently, and just in general tend not to thrive as much as children of authoritative parents. And in terms of many measures of cognitive development and school achievement, authoritative parented children outperform them as well. So, should you encourage and push your children? The science says that's okay. You need to set limits, and there may be situations in which you need to be very encouraging too. But how you encourage the children is critical. What if your child, a 7-year-old learning to play the piano, doesn't want to practice on some particular day? He'd rather kick the soccer ball around in the backyard or maybe play a video game. What should you do? You can encourage, you can even encourage a lot, but you should discuss the consequences of this decision you're both making, that your child is making along with you, about how he's going to spend his time. If you practice a little bit every day, Sebastian, then you'll eventually get really good at this. And wouldn't that be fun? Isn't that something you'd like to do? If the child's answer is no, consistently and very emphatically no, then from an authoritative perspective, I think that's okay. You might continue to press your case for a while, but the research suggests that putting your foot down and saying that he should practice just because I said so is not going to work well in the long run. If you continue to provide attractive opportunities, it's likely he'll eventually come back to play the piano later on his own. When he does, you should praise him for that. And you should pay attention to what works for your child, discuss things more, provide a clear framework of limits. The science tells us that this will work for learning about the piano and about other things that your child might choose to do in his life. The science also tells us that the short-term gains in piano performance that might come from screaming, threatening, authoritarian mommy or daddy will come with some serious potential side effects. For example, Amy Chua has actually taken some steps back from many of the strong statements that she made early in that Tiger Mother book. One of her own daughters went through a period of open rebellion, often yelling at her mother in public, defying her teachers, even gnawing on that piano that she was forced to practice. At the beginning of this lecture, I mentioned that parenting style isn't just about regulating and shaping children's behavior, about regulating and shaping their mental development. It's certainly related to that, but I mentioned that there's something else, something potentially even more important at stake in adopting an authoritative parenting style: moral development. Thinking and research on moral development was actually at the foundation of psychological science and developmental science way back at their beginnings, with philosophers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 17th and 18th centuries. But regardless of whether you believe that children are amoral and blank slates, as Locke would say, or are born good, as Rousseau insisted, recent research is clear about which parenting style is the best for promoting moral development in children. Authoritative parenting works best. One study method that's been used is to present a child with a box and a closed lid on that box. The experimenter explains to the child, there's a really excellent new toy in that box, but no matter what, don't open that box to peek inside. The experimenter then leaves the room and secretly watches the child's actions. The children in this case are typically 3 to 4 years of age. Within a few minutes, essentially all of them give in and look into that box. The test comes when the experimenter returns to the room and asks the child if he peeked. Children raised in an authoritarian environment are significantly more likely to lie about having peeked. When asked a leading question about the toy, this group of children was also far more likely, more than 3 times as likely, to further conceal the truth. The tip here is clear. If you want your children to be honest, you should be authoritative in your parenting style with them. This type of result has been found with many different types of tasks and many different types of moral assessments. Children raised according to authoritative parenting principles are more likely to internalize moral standards and feel guilt when they violate those moral standards. They're more likely to share and behave altruistically in general with their friends. Even their reasoning about moral dilemmas, when you present a vignette to a child and ask them about those dilemmas, that reasoning tends to function at a higher level. And all of these results seem to generalize to every stage of moral development. Children progress through a series of stages, according to research begun by Jean Piaget, the Swiss psychologist commonly described as the father of cognitive development research. It also extends to research developed by Lawrence Kohlberg. The first stages of moral development are simply obeying and looking out for one's own self-interest. That tends to be followed by conformity with what others are doing and following rules. Eventually, children proceed to an adult-like state, an adult-like concept of sort of a social contract and universal principles of right and wrong. Not all children progress in the same way, or at the same times, but what's noteworthy is that an authoritative parenting style seems to have benefits across every stage of moral development. How you tell your child when he's right and when he's wrong accumulates over time into how the child should think about what's right and what's wrong. If a parent fosters the notion that things are right or wrong because I said so, then that's what the children seem to learn. By taking the time to talk with children about your decisions and even your punishments, you can give them a boost toward becoming better behaved children, and ultimately more honest, conscientious, and generous adults. They're also likelier to be happy, more confident, and more successful.